You know that specific heavy kind of exhaustion that settles into your bones, even when on paper absolutely nothing is wrong with your life. You have a stable job, you pay your bills, you might even have a weekend off, but you still feel like you are running a marathon just to stand completely still. To the older generations, you might look like you are simply complaining about the normal, expected responsibilities of adult life that everyone has always had to deal with. But internally, your nervous system is actually carrying a completely unprecedented cognitive load, constantly calculating an endless series of invisible pressures and unspoken expectations. This is the exact psychological experience of millennials, a generation that is constantly told they have it easier while quietly drowning in a completely new kind of structural exhaustion. Society generally loves to look at the tangible surface of your life. The fact that you have a smartphone, a degree, and access to modern conveniences and assume that things are perfectly fine. So when you express that you are profoundly tired, the immediate cultural response is often to dismiss it as simple laziness, entitlement, or an inability to handle basic everyday stress. People do not realize that your brain was wired during an era of extreme, constantly shifting expectations where the fundamental rules of success were rewritten right as you entered adulthood. This misunderstanding often makes you feel incredibly guilty for your own fatigue, silently wondering if there is something fundamentally broken about your ability to simply exist in the world. Feeling completely drained at the end of a seemingly normal day is not about a lack of resilience. It is a perfectly logical response to an overwhelming, invisible structural burden. For those born roughly between the early 80s and the mid-90s, the foundational narrative of childhood was a very clear, very specific promise. Work hard, get a degree, and you will be safe. You internalize this narrative deeply, treating academic and early career achievements as guaranteed protective armor against the economic and social uncertainties of the adult world. But unlike the generations before you, you graduated into a landscape where that protective armor suddenly evaporated, replaced by massive student debt, stagnant wages, and housing markets that felt completely unreachable. You quickly learned that the finish line was not just moving. It was entirely an illusion, requiring you to constantly hustle, optimize, and reinvent yourself just to maintain basic stability. Therefore, when you feel emotionally stretched to your absolute limit, it is because your nervous system is constantly attempting to solve an equation that was actually broken from the very beginning. In psychology, researchers study how chronic exposure to low-grade, unpredictable stress permanently alters our cognitive processing, leading to what is commonly known as high-functioning burnout. Reports from organizations like Gallup show that millennials are experiencing unprecedented levels of burnout, fundamentally driven by a combination of economic instability and the relentless pressure to perform. Furthermore, sociological studies suggest that constantly navigating a gap between promised outcomes and actual reality creates a unique psychological profile characterized by hypervigilance and a persistent fear of falling behind. When your early adult years required navigating major economic recessions while simultaneously being told you just needed to buy fewer lattes, your brain learned to operate in a state of permanent defense. Your mind essentially wires a relentless internal monitor, one that is constantly tracking your finances, your career progression, and your social standing, never allowing you to fully relax. This constant internal tracking creates a strange psychological tension, making you feel both incredibly capable of managing complex systems and deeply profoundly exhausted by the mere thought of tomorrow. Additionally, people who grew up this way often developed a remarkable capacity for extreme self-optimization, treating their own bodies and minds as projects that constantly need to be improved and monetized. While older people might view a hobby as a way to relax your mind, naturally assumes that every single interest must eventually be transformed into a side hustle or a productive skill. This fundamental drive to optimize makes you an incredibly effective worker, but it often leaves you feeling like your intrinsic worth is entirely dependent on your continuous, visible productivity. You are essentially operating on a psychological model of continuous performance, prioritizing the appearance of having everything perfectly together over the comforting, simple safety of just being allowed to rest. You can actually feel this structural exhaustion in your physical body whenever a situation arises that highlights the stark difference between your endless effort and your actual sense of security. It feels like a sudden heavy weight settling in your chest when you look at your bank account mixed with an intense, almost physical craving to just disappear into a dark room. Your nervous system reacts to the constant demands of modern adulthood as if it is actively fighting a predator, even when you are just sitting at your desk answering routine emails. Imagine the sensation of constantly treading water in a very deep ocean, but everyone standing comfortably on the shore is telling you that the water is actually quite shallow and pleasant. It is not that you cannot handle adult responsibilities. It is that your biological system is constantly flooded with the stress hormones required to maintain the illusion that you are perfectly fine. When someone expects you to cheerfully take on extra work, you might feel a sudden spike of deep resentment, a quiet rebellion against the endless extraction of your energy. Your body physically prepares to defend its right to simply exist, bracing itself against an endless stream of obligations that your childhood brain never evolved to anticipate or manage. Even simple things like deciding what to make for dinner or scheduling a doctor's appointment can trigger a strange physical sense of profound exhaustion and deep lingering decision fatigue. Research into human behavior confirms that this constant friction is often a physical stress response to living in an environment that constantly demands more cognitive resources than it ever actually replenishes. This is why spending an entire weekend doing absolutely nothing is not just a preference. It is a fundamental biological strategy for a nervous system that desperately needs to repair itself. This brings us to the crucial shadow side of this wiring. What happens when this constant high-functioning survival mode starts working against your own long-term emotional well-being? The danger is that you might begin to feel profoundly hollow, assuming that nobody truly understands the specific nuanced pressure of constantly running on a treadmill that never seems to stop. You might isolate yourself emotionally from friends who seem to be effortlessly succeeding, and from family members who simply cannot comprehend why you are so tired despite having a good job. This can lead to a self-fulfilling prophecy where you accelerate your own sense of burnout, quietly resenting both the expectations placed upon you and your own inability to just easily meet them. You might also find yourself constantly acting as the ultimate problem solver for everyone else, turning your relationships into arrangements where you are the permanent, exhausted pillar of support. Because you project such an aura of perfect curated competence, people naturally lean on you to manage complex situations, completely oblivious to the fact that you are mentally crumbling inside. When you never allow yourself to admit that the constant pressure is crushing you, you deny the people around you the opportunity to actually understand your specific invisible psychological burden. If you automatically accept every new demand because it feels necessary for survival, you are allowing a deeply ingrained fear of failure to dictate the pace and peace of your adult life. True emotional resilience is not just about effortlessly absorbing every systemic shock. It is also knowing how to safely set down the burden of having to be perfectly fine all the time. The goal is not to give up on your ambitions, but to build enough psychological flexibility to allow yourself moments of genuine, completely unstructured, unbothered existence without any crippling guilt. So how do you navigate a world that requires constant hustle when your mind and body naturally crave the quiet, secure safety that you were falsely promised as a child? It starts with a vital cognitive distinction. You must understand that while your intense work ethic allowed you to survive, constantly running at maximum capacity is currently keeping you emotionally depleted. Acknowledge that your desire to simply stop trying so hard is entirely valid. If lowering your standard of perfection brings you profound peace, enthusiastically embrace it as a medical necessity. You must also practice taking tiny, low-stakes risks with your boundaries, explicitly communicating your need for real rest in a world that assumes constant availability and endless productivity are the defaults. Instead of waiting until you are completely overwhelmed by burnout, try delegating specific areas of your life to be entirely average and simply allowing others to manage their own expectations. To counteract the physical resistance to resting intentionally, observe what happens when you actually enforce a boundary